For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is Unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hello and welcome to another podcast on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet. In a prior podcast, I gave an overview of Revelation chapter 13, and in my last podcast, I made a comparison between the apocalyptic visions of Nephi in the Book of Mormon and the apocalyptic visions of John in Revelation chapter 13. Today, we're ready to embark on a verse-by-verse discussion of what John saw in Revelation chapter 13. To put this in context, remember that the time frame we're talking about is 70 AD, after the ancient church survived the abomination of desolation, and the dragon, or Satan, was wroth with the woman and made war on the remnant of her seed, as described by John in Revelation 12:17. Remember also that there is no interruption or break in the vision between the end of Revelation chapter 12 and the start of the Revelation in chapter 13. For the nutshell version of this podcast, you can check out section 217 in my book that you can find on my new and improved website at unveilingjesuschrist.com. Let's now look at the specific language in Revelation 13:1 that we'll be talking about today, which says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of Blasphemy." Close quote. Before we begin to dissect this language, we need to look at the Joseph Smith translation of Revelation 13:1, which adds an introductory phrase to the King James Version of the same verse, saying, "I saw another sign, in the likeness of the kingdoms of the earth, a beast rise up out of the sea." So before we ever get to the beast rising up out of the sea, Joseph Smith's inspired interpretation tells us that this beast is another sign that represents or symbolizes the kingdoms of the earth. The Joseph Smith translation identifies this first beast as another sign, as opposed to just a sign. And that's because in Joseph Smith translation of Revelation 12:1, you'll recall that there we had a corresponding sign of a woman in the likeness of things on the earth. And so for more on that one, you can go back and check out my podcast on September 14th of 2025. Thus, in Revelation 12, we have a sign of the woman who in a premortal setting represented the premortal church of God in Revelation 12, 1-12. When we saw the likeness of the same woman again in Revelation 12, 13-17, she represented the ancient earthly church of Jesus Christ that Satan was trying to destroy between the time of the crucifixion and 70 AD. Now, here in chapter 13, we have another sign. And this other sign of the beast represents earthly kingdoms that are part of the great and abominable church of the devil that I discussed in my last podcast on January 4 of 2026. This other sign of the first beast is the mirror opposite image of the sign of the woman that represented the premortal church of God in Revelation 12:1, and that then becomes the woman of the earthly church in Revelation 12:13. As Revelation 12 ended, Satan was on the warpath against the remnant of the seed of the woman, representing whatever remained of the ancient earthly church after the abomination of desolation in 70 AD. As soon as Satan's efforts to destroy the ancient church failed in 70 AD, John saw that the first beast rose up out of the sea in Revelation 13:1. Richard Draper describes the conditions as John's vision continues in chapter 13, saying, Foiled in his attempt to destroy the Church of God, the dragon moves to the seashore where there are summons and assistance." Close quote. The sea represents the domain of Satan called the bottomless pit, as I discussed in Revelation 9:1 during my podcast on January 5 of 2025. Among the Jews, the sea represents commotion among people and nations, or chaos associated with evil. Isaiah 57:20 states that the wicked are like the troubled sea when it cannot rest, whose waters cast up mire and dirt. Thus, where the sea is concerned in a symbolic sense, the message is one of commotion, disorder, and anarchy. The Cyclopedia of Biblical, Theological, and Ecclesiastical Literature states that the rising of a beast signifies the rise of some new dominion or government, the rising of a wild beast, the rise of a tyrannical government, and the rising out of the sea, that it should owe its origin to the commotions of the people. So the waters are interpreted by the angel in Revelation 17:15. Close quote. J. Perry also connects the symbolism of the sea with an evil source and a sinful and wicked world. This is consistent with the idea that the sea is symbolically synonymous with the bottomless pit, the abyss, and hell. He said, "In the ancient world, the sea was often associated with evil, with chaos, with the enemies of God. The four beasts Daniel saw also came up from the sea. Sea here may symbolize the nations of the world, as waters does in 17:15. Thus, the beast rises to prominence from among the nations of the world." Close quote. Philip Schaff also points out that the sea, in a symbolical sense, denotes worldly nations of the earth and the whole mass of the ungodly. In this sense, the beast not only rules over the ungodly masses, but it springs out of them as their native king. Richard Draper adds that from certain Old Testament uses, clearly the sea often portrays unsettled political and social conditions, the kind of stormy circumstances from which revolution and tyranny arise. The Revelator sees in the oceans the peoples of the world, those nations and institutions that will originate during and after his day, to carry on a work of darkness." Close quote. The work of darkness described in this quote by Richard Draper is perpetrated against the remnant of the woman's seed, meaning whatever was left of the ancient church after the abomination of desolation in 70 AD. It is a great evil and persecuting power. As the beast rises from the sea, it rises with great power and with one purpose, to destroy whatever is left of the ancient church as of 70 AD. Thus, the first beast rose from the sea of evil with great power to fight against the remnant, or whatever was left of Christ's ancient church after 70 AD. This is what John saw in Revelation 12:17, and that I discussed in my podcast on December 28 of 2025. The Joseph Smith translation of Revelation 13:1 states that the first beast from the sea was in the likeness of the kingdoms of the earth, which Joseph Smith explained, saying, "When God made use of the figure of a beast in visions to the prophets, he did it to represent those kingdoms which had degenerated and become corrupt, savage and beast-like in their dispositions, even the degenerate kingdoms of the wicked world. The beast that rose up out of the sea should be translated the image of a beast." Close quote. Keeping in mind that a kingdom in a scriptural context can mean all kinds of things, including religious or secular institutions, forces, or powers, and in this context, it means the Roman Empire, which is the successor kingdom to the kingdoms of Babylon, Persia, and Greece. John symbolically identifies these earlier kingdoms in Revelation 13:2 as a leopard to represent the Greek Empire, a bear to represent the Medo-Persian Empire, and a lion to represent Babylon. I'm going to talk some more about them in my next podcast. Many scholars correctly identify the first beast in Revelation 13:1 as a symbol for the Roman Empire, but they frequently place its rise from the sea at a date much later than 70 AD. Adam Clarke, for example, put the rise of the first beast after the fall of Rome in 476 AD. John Wesley identifies the first beast as the Roman papacy that rose to power in 600 AD. Joseph Benson's commentary from 1857 lists various possibilities as to the dating and the general consensus in that day as to the meaning of the first beast, saying, "No doubt is to be made that this beast was designed to represent the Roman Empire, for thus far both ancients, moderns, papists, and Protestants are agreed. The only controversy is whether it was Rome pagan or Christian, imperial or papal. St. John saw this beast rising out of the sea, but the Roman Empire was risen and established long before John's time, and therefore this must be the Roman Empire, not in its then present, but in some future shape and form, and it arose in another shape and form after it was broken to pieces by the incursions of the northern nations." Close quote. In other words, he's saying it happened, this rise of the beast from the sea, sometime after the fall of Rome in 476 AD. The Joseph Smith translation of Revelation 13:1 states that the image of the first beast represents kingdoms plural. Even though the Roman Empire sounds like a kingdom singular, it is a very dynamic and changing kingdom. Keep in mind, we're talking about the first beast as a symbol that continues over the course of hundreds of years, even as the Roman Empire evolves from the imperial Roman Empire to the Holy Roman Empire, so the first beast evolves as a symbol within these evolving kingdoms. As we move from the ancient world into the modern world, we also see the first beast evolve into the second beast. John describes this evolutionary process in Revelation 13:12, saying, "The second beast exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him." Richard Draper spoke of this evolutionary process, saying, "For the Christians of John's day, Rome was the epitome of the beast. We must, however, be careful not to define the beast so narrowly that other possibilities are left out. Indeed, the figure represents all trans-temporal powers that have oppressed and continue to oppress God's people from the time of the early apostles through the present age." Close quote. Revelation 13:1 implies that John stood upon the sand of the sea and watched the first beast rise up out of the sea. However, a number of scholars believe that the dragon, Satan, not John, stood on the sandy shore when the first beast rose from the sea. For example, Philip Schaff has said, "Although not expressly stated, there can be no doubt that this beast comes up from the sea at the call of the dragon, who stationed himself for this purpose upon the shore," citing Revelation 12:17, "in order to serve him and be his vice-regent among men." Close quote. Several other well-respected commentators put the dragon on the seashore, but the Joseph Smith translation clarifies this part of the vision by saying that the first beast stood upon the sand of the sea after it rose from the sea, as explained by Richard Draper, saying, "Foiled in his attempt to destroy the Church of God, the dragon moves to the seashore and there summons assistance." There are two manuscript traditions for verse 1. One has John standing on the seashore. The King James follows this one. The other, the dragon, as seen in the RSV and the NIV. The Joseph Smith translation solves the problem by noting that the monster from the sea was what stood upon the sandy shore. Close quote. From this we see that the first beast rose from the chaotic and evil sea and then stood upon the earth to symbolize earthly dominion and conquest. Whenever something or someone is put under the foot of another, it denotes the subordination of that object. The object underfoot is subject to his sovereign. It is like a servant that is subject to his master. The imagery comes from the action of conquerors who put their feet on the neck or body of the person that leads the conquered people. It is a token of triumph, as in the case of Joshua 10:24, where 5 conquered kings were before Joshua, and it says, quote, "When they brought out those kings unto Joshua, that Joshua called for all the men of Israel, and said unto the captains of the men of war, which went with him, Come near, put your feet upon the necks of these kings. And they came near and put their feet upon the necks of them." Close quote. The same imagery is also expressed in Psalms 8:6, which states, "Thou madest man to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet." Close quote. Compare this to Ephesians 1:22, which states, "And God hath put all things under Christ's feet, and gave him to be the head over all things to the church." Close quote. Since the beast rises up out of the sea and then stands upon the seashore, the symbolism depicts the Roman persecutions of the remnant of Christ's ancient church after the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jewish nation in 70 AD, including Rome's complete dominion over the Christians until they were fully and completely subdued, which John describes in Revelation 13:7, saying, "And it was given unto him to make war with the saints, and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations." Close quote. The number of heads, horns, and crowns on the first beast are symbolically significant. They align with various characteristics of the Roman Empire. For example, the 7 heads of the first beast correspond to 7 actual hills on which Rome was built, as explained in Revelation 17:9. Some scholars believe the 7 heads represent 7 Roman dynasties or forms of the Roman government. A 7th head on the first beast has 10 horns and 10 crowns, representing the modern nations that emerged from the Roman Empire after the fall of Rome in 476 AD. The 10 crowns symbolize Roman dominion as a matter of imperial authority, as explained by Richard Draper, saying, "The 7 crowns on the dragon are not laurels of victory, Stephanos, which the woman wears, but diadems, or diadema, symbols of political domination. The scriptures never depict Satan wearing laurels because he wins no permanent victories. The 7 crowned heads suggest the universality of his rule as the king of chaos. They represent Satan's pseudo-claim to royalty set against that of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, whom John describes as wearing many diadems in Revelation 19:12. Close quote. Brother Draper correctly points out that the crowns on the beast are actually diadems, which denote despotic and unlawful rule rather than a lawful monarchy. The book of Revelation is the only place in the New Testament where the Greek word diadem is used. In other places where we find the word crown, it is translated from the Greek word Stephanos, which means a garland or a wreath is meant. This is typically awarded for faithfulness in service. Thus, in 2 Timothy 4:8, it talks about a crown of righteousness. The Stephanos type of crown is a badge of victory in sporting events, an award for military valor, as well as a garland of nuptial joy and festal gladness. The 10 crowns of regal or political rule by diadem coincide with the 10 horns of power on the first beast. Romans took dominion by brute force, so the first beast has 10 horns, which Joseph Seiss has discussed, saying, "We here have a symbolic presentation of the political sovereignty of this world. The beast has horns, and horns are the representatives of power. On these horns are diadems, and diadems are the badges of regal dominion. The beast is said to possess power, a throne, and great authority. He makes war. He exercises dominion over tribes and peoples and tongues and nations. He has control of buying and selling and fixes the conditions on which they are carried on. He furnishes the power to slay everyone who will not come under his regulations, all of which proves political sovereignty and imperial earthly dominion. He is a monstrous beast, including his composition, the four beasts of Daniel." Close quote. Keep in mind that the number 10 symbolically means the whole of a part or part of a whole. Thus, the 10 horns on the first beast represents a great deal of power, but that power is ultimately limited as just one part of the whole of all God's potential power. If the first beast had 7 horns or 12 horns, that would indicate a fullness of power. The 7 heads, 10 horns, and 10 crowns of royal despotism on the first beast are similar to the 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns on the image of the premortal dragon in Revelation 12:3 that I discussed in my podcast on October 26 of 2025. The dragon in premortality was another sign given in heaven that has its likeness upon the earth. That earthly likeness is the first beast. This is exactly why their appearance is almost identical. The only difference is that the dragon in heaven in Revelation 12:3 had 7 crowns or diadem, while the first beast in Revelation 13:1 had 10 crowns or diadem. If we strictly compare the number of crowns possessed by each, we may conclude that Lucifer had less regal authority in premortality than the first beast had on earth, because Lucifer has only 7 crowns, speaking here of the dragon, and the first beast, speaking of the Roman Empire, has 10. But that's not the way symbolic numbers work. For more on the symbolism of numbers in the book of Revelation generally, go back and check out my podcast from October 29 of 2023. The bottom line is that Satan had 7 crowns in premortality because he claimed to possess the full right of rule of God. Remember in Moses 4:1, as Lucifer was jockeying for position during the Grand Council, he said, "Behold, here am I. Send me. I will be thy son, and I will redeem all mankind, that one soul shall not be lost, and surely I will do it. Wherefore, give me thine honor." Close quote. In other words, in the premortal Grand Council, Lucifer claimed that he was above even God. His false claim of all God's regal authority is symbolized by the 7 diadem. The 7 crowns don't indicate that he actually had God's full and complete regal authority. It simply indicates that he's claiming it. The first beast, by contrast, does not and is not in a position to claim God's throne and power. Hence, he only possesses a part of a whole to rule over an earthly dominion. J. Perry comments on this difference between the 7 crowns on the dragon, that is the premortal Lucifer, and the 10 crowns of the first beast, who's representing the Roman Empire, who takes dominion on earth, saying, "The beast has heads, horns, and crowns like its master Satan, with one difference. Satan has but 7 crowns, whereas the beast has 10. In numerology, 7 is a perfect number, but 10 is not, which suggests that Satan has more complete power and sovereignty than his beast, even though the beast has a greater number of heads, horns, and crowns." Close quote. It's also clear that when the first beast begins to take dominion by ruthless means in 70 AD, the scope of his rulership was clearly limited to the Roman Empire. He had no control or regal authority, for example, over the Western Hemisphere in the year 70 AD. This was a time when the Nephite Golden Era or mini-millennium was in full swing. Now, I'm not saying that Satan completely lacked power on the Western Hemisphere. I'm simply indicating that the 10 crowns and 10 horns on the first beast as the instrument of Satan's power on the Eastern Hemisphere was limited to the geographical borders of the Roman Empire in that day. The rule and power of the first beast did not extend in any way to control over the Nephites on the Western Hemisphere, at least as of 70 AD. We also read in Revelation 13:2 that the dragon, or Satan, gave the power of his heads, horns, and crowns to the first beast in 70 AD, saying, "And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his seat, and great authority." Close quote. This delegation of evil power in Satan's earthly kingdom is antithetically parallel to God the Father giving his power to Jesus Christ as the head of God's earthly kingdom on earth, as described by Richard Draper, saying, "As the dragon is the antithesis of God, the beast is the converse image of Christ. Satan bestows on the beast his throne, power, and great authority. The Savior shares these same privileges with the Father. The beast receives authority over every nation, tongue, tribe, and people. The Lamb holds this same dominion." In Revelation 17:8, John states that the beast was and now is, not and will come. This mimics the description of the Savior in 1:4 as he which is, and which was, and which is to come. The Lamb is Lord of lords and King of kings, and the beast seeks the same positions. In short, the beast is the spiritual antithesis of Christ and his kingdom. Thus the beast not only wears the name of blasphemy upon his heads, but it also embodies the name by counterfeiting the attributes of deity. Close quote. The Greek word for beast, Thērion, means wild and untamable. There are actually 3 different Greek words that are translated as beast in the New Testament, as explained by Richard Draper, saying, "The Bible uses the term beast to translate 3 Greek words, zoon, tenos, and Thērion. Zoon describes living creatures, often those connected with God, like the seraphim of Isaiah 6:2-3, and the 4 living beasts in Revelation 4:6-9. Tenos refers to domesticated animals, especially beasts of burden and animals used for food, as in Revelation 18:13. Thērion, on the other hand, characterizes wild beasts, especially beasts of prey. John calls the sea monster Thērion, and the term aptly fits. The beast's 3 components, leopard, bear, and lion, are all untamable and flesh-devouring." Close quote. The Thērion, or beast, appears only one other time in Revelation 6:8, where John saw and described the 4th pale and sickly horse of the Apocalypse. That vision represented the sick spiritual condition of Israel during the period from 1000 BC to 1 AD. Death and hell followed the pale horse, and power was given unto them over the 4th part of the earth to kill with the sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. Close quote. That is, the Thērion kind of beast as a wild, ferocious, and violent beast that is unrestrained. We need only remind ourselves of the genocidal killing of the Jews during the abomination of desolation in 70 AD to see just how accurately the first Thērion beast describes the Roman Empire. Jesus Christ is the earthly head of God's kingdom on earth, and he has many saints who serve him and act as his hands to carry out the works, designs, and purposes of God on the earth. I don't believe anyone would seriously doubt this is a true and correct principle. It stands to reason, therefore, that there must also be an earthly head of Satan's kingdom on earth to direct and guide his first beast and other earthly instrumentalities that carry out the works, designs, and purposes of Satan. Now, if we can agree that this is also a true and correct principle, then we must ask ourselves, who is the earthly head of Satan's kingdom? It cannot be the first beast, because this symbol represents the earthly powers that act at the direction of whoever is the head of Satan's kingdom. As I began my studies of the book of Revelation many years ago, this was a perplexing question for me. The thing that set me off was Revelation 19:20, which states that at the time of the second coming, the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone. When I read this, it was immediately obvious to me that religious and secular institutions, including the Roman Empire, won't be cast alive into the lake of fire burning with brimstone, which is another name for outer darkness, by the way. The Roman Empire no longer exists, and even if it did exist at the time of the second coming, it is not a living entity that could be cast alive into outer darkness in Revelation 19:20. Obviously, we'll talk more about this verse in another 6 chapters. For now, I'm just saying that the only thing that will be cast alive into outer darkness are sons of perdition. They include, on the one hand, Satan and the unembodied spirits that followed and fell with him in the premortal existence. This is one group that can be cast alive into outer darkness, as described by John in Revelation 19:20 and also in Revelation 20:10, which states that after the little season at the end of the millennium, the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are. Close quote. Thus we see that Satan, the dragon, the living head of the unembodied spirit sons of perdition, will be cast alive into the lake of fire or outer darkness. It makes perfect sense. Now we come to the sons of perdition, who become such during this life. Their physical bodies will die, but they live on as disembodied spirits until the time of their resurrection. This group is also cast alive into outer darkness, but who is their living head? That was the conundrum I wrestled with for a long time. If the dragon, or Satan, is the living head of the unembodied spirit sons of perdition cast alive into the lake of fire, who is the living head of the disembodied spirits who became sons of perdition in mortality? The thing that makes this a confusing question is the other living head called the false prophet. He tends to confuse things, so I'm ignoring him in this podcast because I'm going to devote an entire podcast to his identity in the future. So if we just focus on the dragon, or Satan, as the living head of unembodied spirit sons of perdition that is cast alive into the lake of fire or outer darkness in Revelation 20:10, then there really is only one choice for the living head of disembodied spirits who become sons of perdition in mortality. Everything points to Cain, who killed his brother Abel and became perdition, as described by Victor L. Ludlow, who said, "The scriptures specifically name very few individuals who, after having kept their first estate, become sons of perdition. Cain, the murderous son of Adam and Eve, is the classic example of a person who will be consigned to outer darkness. His eternal miserable fate comes not because he murdered his brother Abel, but because, knowing both God and Satan, he rejected the greater counsel which was had from God and loved Satan more than God. Outer darkness is reserved for those who love themselves beyond all others and love Satan more than God." Close quote. Now, if I'm right about Cain, and I think I am, then Cain is the spiritual head of the symbolic first beast, as Satan is the head of the symbolic dragon. We're talking about people who are perdition and stand as spiritual heads over their respective sons of perdition, unembodied and disembodied. Satan is perdition, and his role as a spiritual father to his unembodied spirit sons of perdition is a doctrine that is not in doubt. Cain is the perfect candidate to be the spiritual father of mortal sons of perdition because he became perdition in his life when he killed his brother Abel, as Hoyt Brewster has explained, saying, Cain, a son of Adam and Eve, inscribed his indelible infamy on the pages of history when he inexorably sold his soul to Satan and killed his younger, more faithful brother Abel. Because of his crime, a mark was set upon him, and he was shut out from the presence of the Lord. He loved Satan more than God, and was referred to as Perdition and Master Mahan. Close quote. Since Cain was also perdition, why should he not stand as the head of those who become mortal sons of perdition? Moses 5:24 identifies Cain as perdition, not a son of perdition, saying, For from this time forth thou shalt be the father of his lies. Thou shalt be called perdition, for thou wast also before the world. Close quote. Notice how this verse specifically identifies Cain as the father of his lies. In other words, father, the spiritual father of sons of perdition. Now, this is a very interesting statement also, which says that he's called perdition, not only a son of perdition. It's interesting because it identifies Cain as perdition in this life, but says he was perdition before he was born into this world. Obviously, this does not mean that Cain rebelled and became a son of perdition in premortality. If that were true, then he never would have been born into mortality because he would have failed to keep his first estate. The statement in Moses 5:24 means that Cain was known by the Father in premortality as one who would become perdition in mortality. So if there's this line between those who kept their first estate and those who did not, we might assume that Cain was just slightly above the line, very close to it. Bruce R. McConkie called Cain a friend of Lucifer in the premortal existence. Nevertheless, Cain obviously made the necessary covenants to keep his first estate, but I wonder if he did so insincerely and without real intent. Even if his premortal covenants were deceitfully made just to secure his spot in mortality, Bruce R. McConkie explains that he was not predestined to become perdition. He was clean as he came into this life by the saving power of the atonement like everyone else, as I explained in my podcast on November 25 of 25. Elder McConkie said this of Cain, that son of Adam, though a friend of Lucifer in pre-existence, did manage to gain mortal birth. He could have hearkened to his father Adam and walked in the straight and narrow path, but he instead chose to follow a course which he had already charted in a very real sense in his first estate, an estate where he had been known as perdition. Coming from this background, Cain elected to use his agency to fight the truth in this life, and in his case, he became a son of perdition. Close quote. When Cain became perdition in this life, Satan gave Cain power to stand at the head of all mortal sons of perdition. This occurred very early in this earth's temporal history, when Cain murdered his brother Abel. Moses 5:23 states, If thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and Satan desireth to have thee. And except thou shalt hearken unto my commandments, I will deliver thee up, and it shall be unto thee according to his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Close quote. That is, once Cain became perdition, he was in a position to rule over Satan, as confirmed by Joseph Fielding Smith, who said, As far as Cain is concerned, the information given is definite that he became perdition, and that Lucifer, who is Satan, became subject to him. It appears that the reason Satan desired to have him was due to the fact that Cain had obtained a body of flesh and bones, and therefore had superior power, and Satan was willing to accept and be obedient to him because of that condition. The natural conclusion is, therefore, that a devil with a body of flesh and bones has some power greater than one who was denied the physical body. Close quote. After Cain's murder of his brother, Cain became Master Mahan, the head of Satan's kingdom on earth and a mortal son of perdition, as recorded in Moses 5, verses 30 to 32, which states, "And Satan sware unto Cain that he, Satan, would do according to his, Cain's, commands. And all these things were done in secret. And Cain said, Truly, I am Mahan, the master of this great secret, that I may murder and get gain. Wherefore Cain was called Master Mahan, and he gloried in his wickedness. And Cain went into the field, and Cain talked with Abel his brother. And it came to pass that while they were in the field, Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him." Close quote. Bruce R. McConkie confirms that Cain became the first mortal to be cursed as a son of perdition. As a result of his mortal birth, he is assured of a tangible body of flesh and bones in eternity, a fact which will enable him to rule over Satan. Close quote. Since we know that Cain will ultimately rule over Satan in eternity, it stands to reason that when Cain died, his disembodied spirit entered the post-mortal spirit world, where he ruled over all those disembodied spirits who were once his mortal sons of perdition that he ruled over in mortality. He was still in the post-mortal spirit world when the resurrection began, and Jesus Christ became the first fruit of them that slept. After Christ's resurrection, Cain and other disembodied spirit sons of perdition were not resurrected, but I believe they were released from their spirit prison to have power and influence on earth again, as I talked about in my podcast on December 31st of 2024. This is consistent with John's vision in Revelation 13:1, which states that the first beast rose up from the sea, which is the bottomless pit, the abyss, and hell. These disembodied spirits, acting under the leadership of Cain as their spiritual father, were given great power and influence on the earth. When we then see in Revelation 13:2 that Satan kept his promise to Cain that Cain would rule over Satan, saying, "The dragon gave him," the beast, "his power and his seat and great authority." Close quote. To me, this all makes perfect sense, but since this is a rather novel concept, you may be wondering, what other evidence do I have that the disembodied spirit of Cain has power and influence on the earth given to him by Satan? Consider the words of President Spencer W. Kimball in his book entitled The Miracle of Forgiveness. President Kimball wrote this: "On the sad character of Cain, an interesting story comes to us from Lycurgus A. Wilson's book on the life of David W. Patten. From the book, I quote an extract from a letter by Abraham O. Smoot giving his reflection of David Patten's account of meeting a very remarkable person who had represented himself as being Cain. As I was riding along the road on my mule, I suddenly noticed a very strange personage walking beside me. His head was about even with my shoulders as I sat in my saddle. He wore no clothing, but was covered with hair. His skin was very dark. I asked him where he dwelt, and he replied that he had no home, that he was a wanderer in the earth and traveled to and fro. He said that he was a very miserable creature, that he had earnestly sought death during his sojourn upon the earth, but that he could not die, and his mission was to destroy the souls of men. About the time he expressed himself thus, I rebuked him in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by virtue of the holy priesthood, and commanded him to go hence, and he immediately departed out of my sight." Close quote. Now, if I'm correct about all this, including the timing of Cain's rise from the sea in the image of the first beast in Revelation 13:1, then Cain's disembodied spirit was released from his spirit prison no later than 70 AD, and he resumed his role as head of Satan's earthly kingdom called the first beast. This is exactly consistent with what John saw when he said that he saw a beast rise up out of the sea. The sea symbolizes the abyss or bottomless pit that was the post-mortal home to Cain and other disembodied sons of perdition until the time of their release, as I explained in my podcast on January 5 of 2025, which covered my discussion of Revelation 9:1 that mentions the bottomless pit. Richard Draper confirms that the sea in Revelation 13:1 is the symbolic equivalent of the abyss, saying, the sea, thalassa, is equivalent to abyss, abyssos, the spiritual storehouse of evil where God confines those wicked spirits who defy him. The beast's earthly origin is actually from the unrepentant hosts of humankind. Close quote. Joseph Seiss confirms this also, saying, he is repeatedly described as the beast that cometh up out of the abyss. The abyss cannot mean less than the underworld, the world of lost spirits, the receptacle and abode of demons, otherwise called hell. Close quote. Thus, when the disembodied spirit of Cain rose from the bottomless pit, Satan again gave to Cain his power as Master Mahan, and Cain is therefore the spiritual head of the first beast. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little about the name of the first beast in Revelation 13:1. This verse states that the name of blasphemy was inscribed on each of the 7 heads of the first beast to symbolize its pretense to godliness. Richard Draper explains the symbolic significance of this imagery, saying, the noun blasphemy functions as a descriptive genitive modifying onoma or name. In the ancient world, names were more than labels or markers of identification. They were viewed as an indispensable part of a being's personality, be the person human, demon, or God. Close quote. In general, a blasphemy occurs when evil is spoken of or against God with the intent to cause injury. The Cyclopedia of Biblical, Theological, and Ecclesiastical Literature states that blasphemy, in the theological sense, consists in irreverent or insulting language toward God or his perfections. 3 things, says a divine, are essential to this crime. God must be the object. 2, the words spoken or written independently of consequences which others may derive from them must be injurious in their nature. And 3, he who commits the crime must do it knowingly. Close quote. The first beast was blasphemous because it claimed to be holy and sacred even though it embodied evil. Let me give you some concrete examples of this in the religious history of the first beast in the Roman Empire after 70 AD. The first beast committed blasphemy when the Roman emperors deified themselves. On Asian coins, the emperors are identified as divine and God. Domitian, who was the Roman emperor that exiled John to Patmos Island, required his subjects to address him as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Walter Scott gives us some other examples of this, saying, on the historical application, the names of blasphemy would be those impiously borne by the emperors, several of whom insisted that divine honors and worship should be paid them. Nero was saluted as the Eternal One. Caligula commanded that his image should be placed in the temple to be worshipped side by side with Jehovah. In fact, the deification of the emperors was a standing law in Roman life. This awful feature was introduced on the accession of the Caesars to imperial dominion. Close quote. By way of further example of blasphemy in the Roman Empire, we have the Emperor Constantine, who committed a blasphemy when he made Christianity the state religion of Rome in about 323 AD. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that doesn't really sound like a blasphemy, but consider the circumstances. First, there is general consensus that Constantine was politically motivated to make Christianity the state church. His object in doing so was for him to gain power and to prevail against his enemies in the name of Christ. Melvin J. Ballard spoke of this, saying, "Contrast the work that went forward under the administration of Constantine the Great, who built on the ruins of the church that Christ established, that mighty institution that ruled during the long dark ages. That institution was not established by love and gentleness and persuasion, but by the might and the power and the force of Roman arms. Nation after nation was conquered and found peace only when they accepted Christianity." Close quote. Joseph Fielding McConkie further explains the political aspirations of using a false and apostate form of Christianity as the means for achieving Constantine's political ends, saying, "The creeds of Christendom are a perfect evidence of the apostasy. All Christian creeds trace themselves to Nicaea, where a great council of bishops met under the direction of the Roman Emperor Constantine himself, a sun worshipper. His desire was to unite his newly conquered kingdom, and he saw the Christian church as a means to that end. The difficulty was that Christianity was a host of squabbling factions, and he had first to bring unity to it. Primary among the issues of contention was the relationship between the Father and the Son. For the Council of Nicaea, it was monotheism at all cost, and thus the decision of that assembly that Christ was his own Father." Close quote. Obviously, to promote a false form of Christianity as a true religion for political reasons is nothing short of blasphemy. The Constantinian Church blasphemously taught the worldly precepts of mankind as though they were the true doctrines of Jesus Christ from his ancient church, even though that church was long since gone, as discussed by Monty Nyman, saying, "By the time Constantine joined church and state together in the 4th century, the apostles had been dead for centuries, and the true church and its keys had already been lost." Close quote. James Talmage adds that the great change whereby the church was raised to a place of honor in the state occurred in the early part of the 4th century. It is a popular error to assume that the decay of the church as a spiritual institution dates from that time. The church was saturated with the spirit of apostasy long before Constantine took it under his powerful protection by according it official standing in the state. In support of this statement, I quote again from Milner, the avowed friend of the church. "I know it is common for authors to represent the great declension of Christianity to have taken place only after its external establishment under Constantine, but the evidence of history has compelled me to dissent from this view of things. In fact, we have seen that for a whole generation previous to the Diocletian persecution, few marks of superior piety appeared. Scarcely a luminary of godliness existed." Close all quotes. Finally, let me give you one last example of the blasphemy of the first beast that represents the Roman Empire. After Constantine made paganized Christianity the religion of Rome as though it were a true church, the popes of the ancient Roman Church were blasphemous in their claim to be the vicar of Christ. This means that as a matter of church doctrine, the popes claim to be the embodiment of Jesus Christ, calling themselves Lord God, the universal head and husband of the church. Joseph Fielding Smith said, "This belongs only to God, and that it is a blasphemous expression to apply it to any mortal human." James Talmage adds that the Roman pontiff exercised secular as well as spiritual authority, and in the 11th century arrogated to himself the title of Pope, signifying Father, in the sense of paternal ruler in all things. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the temporal authority of the Pope was superior to that of kings and emperors, and the Roman Church became the despotic potentate of nations and an autocrat above all secular states. Her Pope, claiming himself to be the vicar of God, sat in a state to judge as God himself, and by such blasphemy fulfilled the prophecy of Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 and 4. Close quote. These are just a few of the many examples that could be given of how the first beast, acting through the instrumentality of the Roman Empire, committed blasphemy and thus had the name of blasphemy inscribed on each of the 7 heads on the first beast. So that concludes my podcast for today, covering Revelation 13:1. In my next podcast, we will continue with our discussion of Revelation chapter 13 by looking at the contents in verse 2. So until then, thanks for watching, listening, sharing, and subscribing, and to Jenna and Kristen for all their technological help. I'll see you next time on Unveiling Jesus Christ.